Good evening, everyone. My name is Josh Osborne, and I am the product manager for the CI tools here at Central Innovation. And today what we're going to be looking at is the CI Quantities tool. I'm going to be working in ArchiCAD 24 today, although the Quantities tool also works in ArchiCAD 23, although not in any versions prior to that. If you have any questions during the session, just enter those into the chat panel as we go, and when I get to the end, I'll go through and answer as many of those as I can on air and follow you up afterwards for any that I can't get to. If you don't already have the Quantities tool installed, you can get that using the CI Tools installer, and once you install it, you'll be able to use a 30-day trial inside ArchiCAD so that you can have a play with it and see if it does what you're expecting it to, and hopefully following along with this video, or at least, sorry, following on from this video, you should be able to get up and running hopefully relatively quickly. We're going to be recording this session as well, and that'll be available on my CI in about a week or so. So if you do want to come back to this to view any of the parts to remind you about what happened or to show anyone else, you can refer to the recording for that. Before I get into how the tool works or how to work the tool, first of all, I'll just give you a brief overview of what the tool is for and what it does. So you can hopefully see on my ArchiCAD screen here, I've got this little diagram just showing a sort of a general outline of what the tool is intended to help you do. And so we've got it broken into these three sections. You've got your building design, and that's the building that you already make in ArchiCAD. So this part of producing a bill of quantities you're already doing by creating your model in ArchiCAD. And what we want to do is we want to take that a step further and measure the elements in your building design or your BIM project that you've drawn up already. You can already do this using a variety of methods inside ArchiCAD. You can dimension things, obviously, you can run schedules and that sort of thing. And so the measurement is just how we measure the things that we're interested in finding measurements for in our model. And then the last thing is the bill of quantities, and that refers to collecting the measured items and turning them into something sensible that you can actually use, either as quantities or based on those quantities as costs. And so what the Quantities tool does is that given your BIM project here, it will do the measuring of the bill items that you're concerned about measuring and then produce quantities for you. And you can see here in the bottom, it shows which parts of the interface do which bit. Don't need to pay too much attention to that because we're about to look at how it actually works now. But this is in the documentation on our website if you wanted to refer back to that. So what the idea for the tool is that it allows you to produce quantities inside of ArchiCAD as you are designing your building. The idea is not for it to be a sort of a thing that you do at the very end of building your project or to be a sort of a separate process. It's designed to be built into your design processes so that at all times you can be seeing accurate quantities as you go. It makes it easier for you to see the differences in quantities that any changes you make to that end result. And it will also let you control the degree of detail you want to get measurements out to. The tool is designed to be able to handle as sort of as coarse of a set of measurements as you want, or as fine-grained, or wherever in the middle, because you define the measurements that you want to take and how you want to take them. It also lets you define your measurements interactively as you go, rather than having to create, say, a schedule, which will spit out all of the things that you want to include in your schedule. The idea for this one is that you can go through and build up your bill of quantities and your recipes for that. Sorry, I haven't explained what recipes mean yet, but choose your measurements for that as you go rather than having to create a finished schedule. So again, that's just to help you in the process of sort of working with your bills of quantities on the fly rather than as a finished product at the very end. It also allows you to export all of your measurements and criteria and that sort of thing to other projects, so you can set up a sort of a standard list of measurements that you're interested in and then import that into all of your other ArchiCAD projects so that you're getting the same set of numbers or the same set of measurements out of every project that you work on. So those can be imported and exported, and obviously you could just build them into your template as well if you wanted to use them in all your projects. So that's sort of the main areas that our Quantities tool is aimed at helping you. And so to start with, what I'll do is I'll just go through a very basic, we'll set up one measurement so that I can show you how the various elements of creating a bill of quantities work. So I've just got a blank project at the moment so that we can keep this nice and simple. And what we're going to do as an example to begin with is we're just going to count the amount of walls we have in a model, which obviously is not something particularly complicated to do without using this, but it's a good example just to give you an idea of how things work. So I'm just going to draw a couple of walls here so that we have something to count. So these three walls now are our building design or our BIM project here. And the next thing that we need to do is we need to decide what it is that we want to measure. And that consists of bill items and recipes. So to get into those, go to your CI Tools menu and go to Quantities. And we're just going to open the Quantity Takeoff palette because this is what we'll use to do most of our work with the Quantities tool. If you've used any of our other tools, it probably looks quite familiar. It's quite similar to the Keynotes palette and metadata if you've used those. And this is what we're going to work with for now. I will show you most of how this interface works as we get to it, but for now, let's go into the Quantity Takeoff Manager, which is where we're going to set up our measurements. Now, the first thing that we need to do is we need to set our bill structure. So the way that it works, you can see in the background here that bill items are what everything is based on, and these are essentially the things you want to measure. So you will go through here and create a series of bill items, which are each of the things in this project that you want to measure in some way to produce a quantity based on. So we'll look at an example later which has a lot of these built in, but for now we're just going to make one because all we want to do is count some walls. And I'm going to call this bill item number of walls. So I now have a bill item called number of walls, and what this will do eventually is it will count how many walls this project has in it. So now that I've created the bill item, I need to attach a recipe to it. And as you can see here, brief description, the recipe is the thing that you use to turn the thing that you want to measure into an actual measurement. So at the moment, number of walls is simply a thing, it's sort of a container sitting there saying, I will tell you what the number of walls is, but it doesn't do anything yet. So we're going to go to the recipes section here, and here is where we can tell it how to count the number of walls. So you can see on the left, it's showing my bill items, and on the right is where our list of recipes are. So I'm just going to hit new to create a new recipe. I'll call it wall counter. And now with that recipe selected, I can choose what things I want to measure as part of this recipe. So I'm going to select number of walls from the left here and hit attach. And you can see now it's showing in the recipe section over here that number of walls is showing. Down below here, and we'll go into more detail on how these fields all work, but just to begin with, we're going to keep it nice and simple. So I now have a recipe that cares about the measurement number of walls. And then looking down at the bottom here, we can see we've got a when field here. We're going to ignore that for now, but the quantity was what we're interested in. So this is where you define what the measurement will actually be. You can use expressions and various parameters to generate something sensible with this, but for now, all we're wanting to do is just keep count of something. So I'm just going to enter 1. And so what that means is that every time that the quantities tool comes across one thing that is included in the wall counter recipe, it will add 1 to the quantity. And so by a process of going through all of those, we will eventually end up with a number of walls value, which is the number of walls in our project. So I'll hit OK. And then click on this button here, which you can also get to via the menu and going to here. And what that's going to do is it's going to bring up our bill of quantities. So just to give you a quick rundown of how this works, you'll be able to see on the left that it has a tree of all of the bill elements, the same as we could see in the Takeoff Manager earlier. You can select just a certain bill element that you're interested in seeing the value for, or you can select the top level and it will show you all of the bill elements in your project. Over on the right here, you can choose what you want it to show you a bill of quantities for. So you can either choose your selected elements or the entire project. The calculate button will run the actual calculation, and the export button will let you export your bill of quantities to some other application. You can export as one of our built-in quants files, which is just an XML file, or a CSV file, which is probably what most of you will want to use to export out to Excel or some other sort of costing software that you use or something like that. So at the moment, you can see we've got nothing showing in our bill of quantities here. So I'm going to hit the calculate button to get it to recalculate, and nothing's going to happen. And the reason for that is because we set up a recipe, and the recipe has been told to care about the number of walls measurement and to add a 1 to it whenever it meets the criteria. However, nothing in our project is set to actually match the recipe called wall counter. So it is never actually being run, that recipe, and so it will never show any value because there's nothing there. So what we're going to do now is, using the palette, we'll attach that recipe to one of our elements. So I'm just going to select this wall here, and you can see in the palette on the right here, now that I have a selection, a couple of these buttons have come to life so that I can do things. You can see in the properties and classification where we don't have any properties at the moment, but the classification is showing the classification of this wall. And this will show you just the sort of property and classification metadata of your selected elements as you go. So this is just to make it more helpful for when you're navigating around trying to find what you want. You can easily narrow down what you're looking for. But what we're concerned with at the moment is the recipes. And you can see I have my wall selected at the moment, and there's no recipe showing. So all you need to do is hit this plus button here, and it'll bring up a list of the recipes that are available. And you can see wall counter is ready for us there. So I'm going to select wall counter and hit OK. And now you can see with my wall selected, that wall counter shows as a recipe. However, if I choose one of the other walls, it's not there. It's only in the one that I just attached it to. So now I can bring up my bill of quantities again. I'm going to change to the entire project, and I'm going to hit calculate. And you can see now number of walls, now that it is actually attached to something, it can actually do something. So it has run through. It says that the bill element called number of walls, excuse me, number of walls, has a quantity of 1 now, and we only applied it to one thing, so that's working exactly as intended so far. So that will just go through and it'll count all of the things that we have attached that recipe to. Now, you're not going to want to go through your project and manually have to attach recipes to everything that you want. That kind of defeats the purpose. So what we're going to do next is we're going to go in and tell the recipe to automatically apply itself to certain elements. So I'll go back into the Takeoff Manager, and I'll select the wall counter recipe again. And we'll just look up at the top here under the recipe properties, which you probably saw before. You can see there's this field here which says add when. When it's blank, it will never add this recipe to anything. So that means that this particular recipe at the moment can only be manually applied, which we used before by pressing the plus button. However, as soon as we enter something in here, it's going to assess whatever criteria we put in here and only apply the recipe to that thing, but always apply it to all of that thing. And so what we're going to say for this one is we're just going to say the element type equals wall. Now, if you are, oops, I've spelled element wrong. If you have used expressions inside of ArchiCAD at all, or dealt in detail with the schedules inside ArchiCAD, this probably looks familiar to you. The Quantities tool uses the standard notation that ArchiCAD uses for defining elements and that sort of thing. So most things are set out in this object way. So we are interested in the element, and then a dot, and then specifically the type of element, and then we want it to only be the elements where that value equals a wall. And most of our other queries or criteria that we have in here will look similar to this, and we'll look at those in more detail in future. But for now, we're just going to say element.type equals wall, and if I click away from that, if I had got something wrong in here and I clicked away, it would give me an error saying that criteria doesn't make sense to it. So you can easily spot if you've made a typo or something else wrong in your criteria. I'll just go back in and correct that, and you can see it didn't give me a warning that time, so that means it's okay with that recipe. It thinks it's good now. So we're going to leave number of walls as it was. It's just going to count the number 1 each time it gets run. But now it's going to apply to all wall type elements. So if I hit OK now, and I go and select this wall, you can see that wall counter is still there as it was before, but wall counter is now shown in italics, whereas before it was shown in normal text. If I select this wall here, you can see that wall counter is also selected for that one, and for this one too. So it's been applied to these two walls automatically because they meet the criteria for the recipe that we've set. This one here already had it applied, so it didn't need to pick it up automatically, but it does meet the criteria, so it's also being included automatically now. And so now if I open my bill of quantities again and calculate for the entire project, you can see that my number of walls is now 3. So it's done exactly what we wanted it to. Obviously, this is a very, very simplified example, but just to give you an idea of how each piece of the quantities relate to each other, going from a bill element, in this case, the number of walls, to a recipe, in our case, a wall counter, which is automatically applied to all walls now, and all it does is increment the number by 1. Through to the bill of quantities here, where you can see how that actually is applied to our model. So that's number of walls, wall counter, and we've used add when to create the number of walls here. Now, obviously, you can see in this box here that there's plenty of room to add other bill elements to this. The idea here is that recipes would generally be applied to sort of certain element types, and there would be a number of bill elements included with those. And when that's the case, you may want to have only some certain things show in certain cases. So at the moment, the wall counter will always count every single wall. So you can see the element type equals wall is the only time that this whole recipe will run. And then this number of walls one here is going to get 1 added to it, but our when field is empty there. So that means that this will just always be the case. However, we can narrow this down a bit further if we want to. We could come in here and we could say that the number of walls should only be increased by 1 when the surface of the wall in question is brick or something like that. We add that to our when field here, which would be I don't have it on hand, but the option will be excuse me while I look this up. So, it will be finishes here. So we can say that this should only apply when the finishes attribute is, say, brick or contains the word brick. You can see in here there's a couple of examples of how that can work. The building material, including the word brick, and that sort of thing. And so the way that we can build that, you can see going from there, you could make this wall counter, if it were of any use, which it probably isn't in most cases, you could make it only count brick walls by using a when condition there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to flick over to another project which we've already created a lot of recipes in, so that you can see how a lot of those work and look. We'll run through a bit of how they work, and I'll export a bill of quantities so that you can see how that looks as well. And then I'll see if we've got any questions. So okay, so in this project, you can see I've just got a variety of elements placed in my floor plan view. Obviously, these aren't particularly sensible at the moment. The main thing that I'm interested in this file is just to be able to have things that I can measure so that you can see what they look like. So I'll open up the quantities palette again. And if I select my wall, you can see at the moment, I have a couple of recipes already selected. So you can see general and wall are currently showing as recipes here, and they're both in italics, which means that they are auto-applied recipes rather than recipes that have been manually added to this element. You can also see that the properties of this particular wall are displayed, and the classifications. So these are just the classifications and properties that are built into the wall element, but using these as a way of going through your model and finding the pieces that you want to apply your quantities to can be very helpful. And a lot of these refer to the things that you are going to be measuring. So showing those as you're working with quantities, it makes a lot of sense. So with general and wall at the moment automatically showing, we can probably guess that general is a set of recipes that applies to everything, and wall is one that applies to walls. So if I go over here and select, say, this mesh, you can see that general and mesh are applying there. Those are just lines. We've got a slab over here, we've got general and slab, and also one called dummy. And you can see that dummy is showing in plain text rather than italic. So that means it's been manually applied to this element in particular. So let's go and have a look at what these recipes do. I'll open up my takeoff manager, and you can see that I have a structure of bill elements already made in this project. Everything is put into folders just for the sake of neatness, and the way that you can create folders in your build structure is just by dragging. So I've just made two new ones called Untitled, and if I wanted to turn this 16 Untitled into a folder, just select 17 and drag it on top of 16, and now 16 is a folder and 17 is inside it. So it makes it nice and easy to work with creating extra bill elements here, but you can see that there's a whole lot of these measurements in this project already. So we've got under wall, we've got regular wall type, wall thickness, and various other things to do with measurements that we care about in the wall. We also saw general that we had selected, and you can see that there's a lot of very generic settings in this one. So we've got the length, surface, type, volume, and that sort of thing, and so on and so forth through all of these folders. So these are just a sort of a fairly generic standard set of measurements for us to use in this bill of quantities. So looking at the recipes, you can see the recipes that we're showing before. We've got general, slab, and dummy were there before, and you can see that those are in this list here. So let's just have a look at general first. So I'll select general. And you can see that the first thing we've got going on here is that the when, so that is the conditions under which it applies this to things, is that it will apply when the element type is contained in this following list, and then the list is just basically every element, or at least every model element, that is. So we're not including 2D data, but any model elements, roofs, beams, walls, columns, etc. All of that stuff is going to be automatically included by this general recipe. And then it runs through just a big list of all of our bill elements so that we can measure each of those things. So you can see in here we've got the 1.1 is showing us the ID of the bill element concerned. So you can see 1.1 length is just coming from the fact that it's in folder 1 and it is number 1. And so it just numbers that way. So 1.1 length, and then it shows you as much as it can of the quantity calculation here in this list as well. But when you select it, you can see it below also. It's just that you can get quite long with some of these, so sometimes you'll need to click on that to be able to see the full thing, but in most cases here, you can see it already. And you can see we're measuring a bunch of fairly standard things that you'd be interested in. So length is using the quantity formula element.length. So as we saw before, element.type, in this case element.length, most of the things in here will follow that similar format, and that works in a very, very similar way to the expressions tool that's built into ArchiCAD. It works in the same way that that does. So if you're familiar with that already, this should be relatively easy to pick up. So you can see there's a couple of surface elements there. We've got the volume, the type. This one's a little bit different, so let's have a look at that. So you can see on this one in particular, the quantity is just 1 again. So this is a sort of a counter as we had before, and in this case, it is only happening when the element type is wall. So this was just an example that we set up. So it is essentially reproducing the wall counter from the previous project, but it's applying it to the general thing. And so when we look at our bill of quantities and our list of general items, we will see that there's one called type there that's just going to show the count of the walls that are in the project. It's fairly poorly named bill element, that one, unfortunately, but you get the idea there. And then we go back to some more normal looking ones. So width, depth, height, and perimeter all look like how you'd expect them to. And then we get into a couple more sort of conditional ones. So you can see here the level, the name, the ID, and various other ones here. They're all set to 1. And the reason for that is that these ones, again, are just sort of test bill elements that will check for a certain thing and then keep count of how many meet that criteria. So in this case, element.level equals 1. If that's the case, then add 1 to that measurement. If the name contains the word chair, then add 1 to that measurement. If the ID contains the word testing, add 1 to that. So you can build up a sort of a counter of certain types of elements in your project, or certain values of elements that you're interested in keeping a count of the number of, which this can be useful for. And there's also a few others, not in this list, in the specific element list as well, which work similarly as well. And they will give you a good idea as well of what sorts of things you can do, what you can use this for. So in this case, the element material includes the phrase masonry brick facing, which is probably something that you will want to use in some cases, as I mentioned before, where you only want to count the walls that are of a certain type or something like that. So that can be useful for that. We also get into a little bit more tricky territory at this point. So you can see the material volume here. You can see that what we're interested in is the dot volume of something. But specifically what we're interested in is the volume of the elements whose material is masonry brick facing. So the actual measurement for this is the volume, but we're referring to the material here because we only want to measure the volume of things that have that material selected. So this is a kind of the next step up from simply counting that as we were doing here. This now is not only counting it, but adding up the total of the volume of all of the things that meet that criteria. And we do the same thing for area, thickness, and number of skins as well. So you can compound things in that way. You can count or get the total measurements for certain things that meet criteria in that way as well. Got a couple of other conditional things here where the certain finish is equal to that. And again, it's just counting it. And I think the rest of these ones are all fairly standard until we get to here. So yes, excuse me. Sorry about that. So you can see here we've got a couple that, this one here in particular is just doing a compare, but this one here is doing a, I guess a logical operator, I think it's called. It is saying that instead of run this when a certain thing is something, this one's saying run this when a certain thing is above a certain value. So in this case, when parameter A, which it could be anything, is above 0.6, then add 1 to the count. And so whenever it finds an element that meets that, it'll increment the count, and whenever it finds one that doesn't, it'll just breeze past. And so you can use this to count various things that might be of interest to note in that way as well. I'm just going to, most of the rest of these look like how you would expect. You can see on this one we're counting the renovation status of existing there, so you can look into those as well. But I'm just going to look over at wall, and you can see there's a couple that we use over here which might be of interest. So wall slant in particular, what we're doing here is if the wall slant outside is greater than 0, then we add a 1 to this. And so what this is going to do is in our bill of quantities, it's going to show us it's going to show us the amount of walls that are slanted, because it's counting any time there is a wall which is anything other than just directly straight up and down. So if you have certain things that you want to measure, say whether walls are slanted, or if you wanted to measure any of those things, this can be very useful for that as well. So you can see there's a whole range of recipes built into wall as well, and they all work roughly the same way as those other ones did. They're just counting the various things that you might want to do. So I'll just close that, and we'll have a look at our bill of quantities now that it's showing a decent set of things. So you can see we've got our our bill elements on the left here. I'm just going to change to entire project and hit calculate. We just need to wait for a few seconds because there's quite a lot going on in this project, so it has to go and collect up all of the parameters. The first time takes a little bit longer, but times after that will be much quicker. And so you can see it's produced a fairly large bill of quantities here because there's quite a lot going on through our various bill element measurements. So you can see if you open up certain folders here and select certain elements, you can narrow down to just the specific one that you want to look at, or you can just select the top level and show all of them. So you can see we've got our general ones first because that was folder number 1. And so it's all of these things where it's just measuring the length of, because it was applying to everything, it's just measuring the length of anything in this project. So that number is not going to be particularly useful because it's just the length of everything there, but you get the idea of what it's doing there. And it's running through various things here. You can see also here that some things have units assigned to them. That is something that I forgot to mention that was back in the bill structure. If we go in and select any of the bill elements, you can see that the rate per here sets the units for the thing that you're looking at. So essentially all it affects is how it displays in your bill of quantities, but that's probably something that you'll want to make sure you specify there. And so you can choose that units that you want there. There's a couple of them in there at the moment, but you can just hit edit units here and add any other units you might want to show in that. And you can also use no unit as well. So for things like the count and that sort of thing, it doesn't really make sense to have a unit for that, so just set that to nothing. But yeah, so that's where that unit is coming from. So length is set to meters, but surface is set to meters square, as you'd expect, and so on through here. Type was a count variable, so that one's just not showing any units. And you can see that it's counted 13 of that type. I forget what the type was that we said now. I think it was where the element type was walls. So it's saying that there's 13 walls in the project, which looks about right based on what we've got placed there. Looks about 13 or so. And so we can go through and look at the rest of the list this way. So if we get through the general stuff, we can see we're starting to get into the wall values. So this is showing the length of all walls summed up together, which is probably something that would be of interest in certain cases, the surface and various other things. You can get the idea of how it's working now. And so you can see there's quite a lot of things here that are counters, like regular wall type and that sort of thing. And there's also quite a lot of things that are just plain measurements as well. At the moment, most of our items just have, in fact, all of our items have a rate of 1 at the moment because we have not assigned any costing information to our bill of quantities. And this may not be something that you even want to do. If all you're interested in doing with the tool is producing actual measurements and numbers, or literally just quantities out of it, then you can just do exactly what we've done in this example and ignore it entirely. Everything has a quantity at a rate of 1, so its cost and its quantity will be the same, and you can essentially just ignore this cost section here. However, if you do want to do that, just go back to the takeoff manager, select the thing that you're interested in. These are just all measurements, so it doesn't make sense, but I'll show you where it is anyway. And you just set the rate down here. So at the moment it's 1 per nothing because this is type. And so it's going to give us just a cost that equals the quantity at any time. But one of the things that you might want to do, say, is give a estimate of how much the walls are going to cost. You could use the inside or outside surface and then enter whatever you've calculated the rate of square meterage of wall costs, enter the number in there. Let's say something like that. That was a wall surface outside. Recalculate again. And you can see now wall surface outside, it's measuring it at 101, but the rate is 2.3, so the cost is calculated there. So if you are wanting to use costing, you can enter all of your rates in as part of the bill elements, and it will calculate those for you properly as well. And if you need to do extra calculations there, you can also do that too. So you can add in the rate. So instead of having a bill element which was wall length and attaching a rate to that, we could add a bill element that was called, say, number of bricks, which would have a rate of however much it costs per brick. And then we could set the recipe for number of bricks to be calculated based on the what's the word I'm looking for? The surface area of the wall divided by however many bricks fit into that space. So it can be chunked down in that way as well, depending on how sort of fine-grained you want to get, if you want to measure it down to that level, or if you just want to say, I have X many walls, you can go all the way up to there, which obviously won't be very accurate, but it just sort of lets you choose the degree of detail that you want to go to. So the last thing that I want to show you before we have a quick look if there's any questions is just exporting. To do that, you just hit the export button, which is nice and easy. And I'm just going to choose a CSV file. And it will export that. So you can then open it in Excel, or if you have some sort of online costing thing or any other program that you use to collect this stuff, you can see it pretty much is just laid out the same way that it was shown in the palette here. So you can use this for whatever you'd need to. So it's sorted by the key, which in our case, in the ArchiCAD Quantities tools case is the bill item. Then we've got a reference if that was entered anywhere in the bill element, the title, so the name of the bill element and description, the quantity that was calculated, the rate, which is all one, as we saw before, the units, if there are any units assigned, and then the cost calculated based on the rate and the quantity together. So, of course, if you're using some external costing software, you would just bring in the CSV file and then trim out the rate and cost fields here, because you'll be assigning your own using whatever software you use. And since it's a CSV, it should be able to import into pretty much everything, I would think. So that's a sort of a general overview of the quantities tool. Hopefully that made some sense. If you do have any questions, we have documentation available on our website on MyCI. Just head to myci.centralinnovation.com. And once you log in there, head to the My Knowledge Base section, and there's a quantities manual there. It does have reference of all of the attribute names that you can ask it for, and documentation about how the tool works as well. And if you have any questions about how to build up your recipes or how to make your lists of elements, or in fact any questions about it, just go to the support section on MyCI there, and you can ask their technical support team there any questions that you have, and we should hopefully be able to help you through figuring out how to make that work. The tool itself is relatively new, so we know how we want the tool to work and how quite a few of our customers want it to work, but I'm sure there are plenty of use cases that are not quite what we were thinking of, so we'd love to hear feedback from anyone who is using it to get an idea of what you're using it for, what parts of it are useful to you, and if there's any parts that could do with say changing or having some extra options added to, or anything like that, because we are always trying to improve the tools to be more useful to you. So if you do have any feedback about what we could do, or any particular questions that you'd like to see documented, or webinars like this or anything like that that we could help you with, please do send those suggestions through, because we do look at all that stuff, and we'll incorporate it into our future plans for the development of the tool and how we write our documentation and everything for it. So thanks everyone for attending. As I said before, the recording will be available online on MyCI probably in about a week's time or so. That will be on MyCI as well in the webinars section. And what I will do also is I will pull the recipes out of this file in particular, the one that I've been showing you here, because this is a really good example of what you can sort of do with the recipes. And I'll put that up on the website as well. And I think in future versions of the tool, we might actually set that so it installs with the tool, so that you'll always have it as reference. But I'll put it up as a extra download for now, so that you can browse through that, import it into some of your projects, and just see what kind of numbers you get out of it when you run the calculation on it. All right, thanks very much, and I'll catch you at the next webinar.